Thanks a ton for joining us today. As you see in the lower left-hand corner, I'm Justin Clifford. I work at Bereave. I will be your host today. Super big day around these parts. This is our first Loss Leaders event. We've already got the next 8 or so booked with some incredible guests and incredible topics. So plan on Loss Leaders being a staple in your Wednesday if you'll have us. Usually as close to noon Eastern time as we can get, but we might fluctuate a little bit. Also, another big reason that we're excited about today is that Bereave is officially open to take beta members in our new Bereave for Business platform. The goal is really to make the uncomfortable topic of death much more accessible and actionable in supporting teammates in the workplace who suffer a loss and are grieving. It's low cost, low lift, low implementation, a huge win for culture, huge win for your teammates. So if you're interested in seeing what it's all about, let us know. We'll get some time booked. Now, enough of my nonsense. You are not here for me. You are here for Faith Holloway, who resides in London and is kind enough to take time out of the end of her day to be here. Faith is the Compassionate Employer Program Lead for Hospice UK. Faith has seen dozens of bereavement policies over the years. And while she's been consulting and coaching and designing and delivering training to companies like PwC and Christie's and Deloitte, she and her program have been supporting over 100,000 employees. And the time that I've gotten to spend with Faith has been such an inspiration in that she's truly a model for how we could and should start thinking about showing up for teammates at work during some of the toughest times that show up in their lives. Faith, welcome to Loss Leaders.
Thank you. I always love when you introduce me because it's like I get so hyped, you make me sound so good. I love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of reason to. Also, you might see, or you should see Georgina. Georgina's a little bit of a surprise guest. Georgina Forrester also joins us today. The fact that you'll hear her accent is somewhat similar to Faith's compared to mine is pure coincidence. But Georgina joins us on the back end of the program today to talk a bit about the experiences that her team, her workplace, provided her as she reacclimated to life after losing her mom. A big part of what we hope to do at Bereave is really highlight what good looks like. And Georgina's team provided an experience that really we can all learn from. And she has very generously stepped up to talk about it today. So Georgina, welcome to Loss Leaders.
Thank you. Good morning and afternoon, everyone.
The chat is open, so we'll monitor it for questions as we go. Probably won't get to all the questions live, but we will plan on including Q&A in our follow-up. So we'll also hope to get you out of here at about 1:15 so you can refresh before meetings at the top of the hour. So I guess with that, let's get started. Faith Holloway again from Hospice UK. Can you talk a little bit, first of all, about Hospice UK as an organization and the role they play throughout the UK?
Sure. Yeah, I'm conscious that the audience today is a huge range, like you said, but maybe a lot of people from the US. So Hospice UK, we're the national charity for end-of-life care. So we have around 200 hospices that exist in the UK, and they all sit within our membership. So we're kind of the national body for hospices. It's probably the easiest way to describe it. Compassionate Employers is our workplace program. We've been delivering it since 2019, so quite a few years now. And we really saw it as a win-win. How do we get that hospice expertise into workplaces and adapt it in a way that's kind of digestible and works for employers? And it's also a revenue stream for us, which we're very transparent about. Hospices at the moment are facing huge amounts of, the cost of living crisis, but also in general, just at a deficit. We have to raise hundreds of millions of pounds every year. So I like to think of it, it's why I'm so passionate about it. I know that I'm doing good for organizations, but they also get to do something really good for us. So I think in terms of bereavement programs, workplace programs that are out there, I think, I'm biased, obviously.
Sure,
I think,
of course.
We're doing a real kind of authentic win-win for organizations.
Yeah, I love that. So can you talk specifically about your team and really walk us through with what your team is tasked with? What are the outcomes that your team is focused on?
Yeah, so I think what was really clear to me when I joined the program, the kind of differentiator between us and maybe some other programs, the space is really kind of big at the moment, at least in the UK. I don't know what the kind of landscape is there in the US, but yeah, it's become very kind of saturated, if I want to use that word. A lot of people who experience bereavement who want to go out there and make changes, which I think is fantastic. A lot of it I see is focused on things like training, things that are happening kind of in a silo, one-off events that can do some good in the moment, but don't necessarily have that long-lasting impact that we want to see. So we know that one of the things that makes us different is that we look at an organization holistically. So that means when an organization onboards with us, we go through an assessment with them. We look at everything from their policies to what peer support do they offer, how recently have they communicated about grief, do they get involved in awareness days, all of those things. And we look at it, and thanks to doing this with quite a lot of organizations now, we have some good benchmarking, not only by sectors, but just nationally across the board. So we can give organizations that real sense of where do you stack up against the market. I think there's, at least in the UK, there's almost no information about that. Sure. It's really difficult to find out what other organizations are doing, which makes sense, right? You kind of want to keep those policies close to your chest. But then we do offer that same support that people are expecting and that we see other organizations doing, things like delivering training. We have a really great e-learning tool that we made with PwC that simulates bereavement conversations, which I think is really cool. Haven't really seen other people doing that, at least not yet. We'll see if it sparks some inspiration. And yeah, we have things like our members hub where people can get resources. And I think the thing that I've always been really passionate about with our work is, and I think we've talked about this, Justin, a little bit, like, you know, like the fluffiness, the vagueness of grief. Sometimes I was just saying on a session earlier today, you know, why are line managers still finding this difficult? I think it's because we're feeding them this information that's like, be compassionate, be a good listener, be supportive of your team. It's like, what does that mean? Give me the tangible, practical things of that. Like, if I'm being a good listener, what does that look like? If I'm not being a good listener, how do I know that? Are you giving me feedback? Are you giving me opportunities to practice that? So we try to keep it super practical. Right. So again, I'm biased. I lead the program. It's kind of mine and my team's vision. But I think what we're doing is innovative in this space. It's not just talk. It's not just one-off. Like we follow up with all of our workshop attendees 3 months afterwards. What's working? Is there anything you're struggling with? What have you retained? What have you not retained? What can we help with? We're about impact. We're not about just ticking a box, which unfortunately I feel like grief has become a little bit one of those topics. And I just really want to make sure we avoid that.
Sure. So can you talk a little bit about, you talk about the companies that are bringing you in. I'm curious, what is happening at those businesses that make them say, hey, this is something that we should do. I know there's a lot wrapped up in culture, and there's a lot wrapped up in benefits, but what are the kind of the drivers that ultimately get somebody to raise their hand and say, yeah, we'll do that. We should do that.
Honestly, I wish it wasn't the case, but it's some form of tragedy in an organization. So usually when an organization comes to us and says, I needed your support yesterday, what can you do for me? It's because I've had a death in service. I've just spoken to a very large organization who's potentially coming on board this week, but they've had 2 death in services, 2 employees die within the last 6 months. They weren't prepared for it. They didn't have support. Their HR team felt completely out of their depth, not because they lack the skills or the expertise, but because they're not grief experts. They don't know how to talk to people about death and dying. They don't know how to set up an appropriate memorial when someone in their organization dies. So unfortunately, I think a lot of it just comes from tragic events, someone dying that maybe was expected, that maybe wasn't. A lot of the times it's a senior leader who comes to us and says, my husband died, or my partner was really sick, or I've just been bereaved by a parent. I went to go look at our bereavement policy. I was embarrassed. I was shocked at what we offer to our employees, and we need to change it, but we don't know where to start. So oftentimes it does come from personal experience, which I think is a shame. And I see that a lot in the grief space as well. A lot of us who end up becoming advocates for a better grief support is because we've been through it and we know how bad it is and how bad it feels to be treated that way. But I would love to see more organizations being proactive, because as much as we can help, it's really difficult to come in when someone has already died and then they say to us, what should we do? What can we be doing? But it's been 2 weeks, or in some cases it's been a month. And then we have to onboard them and go through, the general kind of paperwork and all those things. We can't avoid doing those. So yeah, it's a shame when people come to us at that point. I wish people were more proactive.
Right. So it ends up being because they're reactive. There ends up being a lag in the support that you're able to provide because of the administrative things that need to occur to be able to stand up the training and stand up all of the support that you can provide.
Yeah, and it can, I mean, we can be quick, we can be adaptable, we can, you know, forego some of the more kind of nitty gritty things to get support in place. But even if we're being, you know, I've had conversations with people like, can you get on a call with me today? Because we just had an employee die. Yes, I can get on a call with you that day, but what have you sent in the time that we're waiting to speak? So sometimes even, you know, 2-3 hours can be a huge difference. If a team is waiting for you, they've just found out that their colleague has died, and they're all sitting around going, what's happening? Why isn't my manager said anything? Where's the senior leadership? Where's the process for this? Are we coming to work tomorrow? All of these questions. And you're saying, oh, hold on, you know, give me a couple of hours. I just need to go talk to someone. They're like, why don't you know how to do this? Why don't you have a process? You know, it puts you up to seem like you failed in that space. So even in the quickest circumstance, it still is like a massive gap that's very obvious to your employees.
Sure. So it sounds like it's incredibly reactive, and I've got I do want to talk about maybe trends that you're seeing at some point, but you also mentioned people that might be embarrassed by their policy after going through an experience. And as much as I would really like to dig in on what embarrassment looks like, we'll do that in a second. But I would really like to start with maybe what does the best of the best in your mind look like? What are the characteristics of a great policy that if someone experiences, maybe a senior leader experiences a loss and they turn to their policy and they go, wow, this is really great. What might that look like?
I'm a list girl, so I'm gonna give you 5 things. I tried to I went back through all the policies that I really love and looked at things like trends and what people are asking us for, and I kind of identified like 5 key things that I think we're seeing, but also I think are there for the long haul. I don't think these are trends necessarily. I think it's kind of just the future of policies. So the first one is that we're seeing bereavement policies specifically that aren't in other policies. So employees want to see a policy that it doesn't just sit as page 11 of a standard leave policy. They want some recognition that bereavement is significant and that it deserves its own policy, deserves its own kind of time and attention to it. But then on top of that, they're incredibly short. So I've been really surprised at some of the policies that we're getting lately, and some of the policies, once they go through our recommendations, you see an 8-9 page policy be condensed into a page or 2 pages, because there's a recognition that when you're bereaved, or if you're a manager who is the more likely person to be reading this policy, and you're about to go into a conversation with someone, or you've just found out that someone in your team is bereaved, you don't have time to read 9 pages. And if you do, you're going to be skimming that, making your own assumptions, making your own kind of judgments on what that is. So making it super clear, this is what you need to know. And I literally read one just this week that said, top things to know, other bits that might be relevant, here's kind of the next steps, and just laid it out super simple and very kind of almost like formulaic, like this is exactly what you need to know. These are the kind of questions we're expecting. The second one is that we're seeing a shift, and people have been asking us for this more and more. Someone even just asked me for it yesterday. What are the words we should be using? What's the tone? I think we're moving away from policies sounding inhuman, kind of restrictive, clinical. I'm really shocked at some of the words that people use sometimes in the language that they use, especially when I know the person that has written the policy, which is often the case. I think, you don't talk like this. I know that you're a warm, empathetic, compassionate person, and your policy makes you sound like you're a robot. And it's really strange why that happens sometimes. So I think, you know, one of the biggest tips we give to the people that we work with when they're rewriting their policies is read it out loud. If you wouldn't feel comfortable saying it to someone's face, you need to go back and rewrite that policy. And sometimes it doesn't seem like the most kind of professional or HR-centric thing to do, but talk about what you want people to feel when they read that policy, or how you want people to understand the support that you offer, and record yourself saying that and then go from there, rather than trying to infuse like warm, friendly words into a really robotic policy. Start with what you want to say, how you want it to feel, and then kind of go from there. The third one I would say is we're seeing a ton of flexibility, or more flexibility. So one of the only members that we have, or the only member currently who has received our Gold Award, which is kind of, I know today we're talking about gold standard and kind of best practice. One of the reasons that they got that, which is Aviva, who's one of the largest insurance providers here in the UK, they have, I think, around 18 million customers. So huge, huge organization. which is to say, if they can do this, I think other organizations can too. One of the things that really stood out when we looked at their policy was they offered a really generous amount of bereavement leave, around double the national average here in the UK, but they were also super flexible with when people could take it. So their employees can take it as hours rather than days, which we loved. They can take it, we're seeing organizations saying you can take pre-bereavement leave if you know that someone is unwell, or if you're anticipating that you're going to be bereaved, take that time to be with your family as well. And also things like if you want to celebrate or observe an anniversary, if you have religious holidays, or there's some cultures where there are things that you do a month, 3 months, a year down the line after someone dies, recognizing that people might want a day off that's paid to do that with their family. So flexibility around recognizing it's not just the funeral, it's not just the immediate kind of time period that they're going to need leave. The fourth one, which is my personal favorite one, because I think it's super archaic, but everyone still does it, is defining or differentiating between family members. So one of our members, Co-op, which is a really large retail group here in the UK, they switched recently to closeness of bond, which I really liked. So they don't say if it's a parent, a spouse, a child, you get this amount of days, everyone else gets that amount of days. It's recognizing that, these traditional family structures that we've often relied on don't really exist anymore. People grow up in multi-generational households, they live far away from their family, let people decide who they're close to rather than deciding it for them. And the last one, number 5, this was long-winded, but hopefully this is useful to lay it out in the structure. But I think something we're definitely seeing, particularly the employers who get it, kind of get being a compassionate employer and really live and breathe that, is they're trusting with their policy. So I think we talked before about, policies can be such a temperature check of your organization generally. I think, I posted something recently that was like, show me your policy and I'll tell you about your culture. If it's 9 pages, super restrictive, watertight, your culture is probably really bad. You probably don't trust your managers. You probably don't trust the people that you've hired to do their job, or trust that they're going to live your values. So Patty McCord at Netflix kind of famously said, she only tolerated fully formed adults, which is to say, if you've hired the right people, if you've trained your managers well, you can have a trusting policy where you're generous, you're flexible, you let people decide who they should take leave for. Because, who are we to say that, one person deserves more leave than another, or how quickly you should be back at work? I think, trust your people to make the right decisions. And when you do trust your people, you can have this super short, direct, clear policy that is open to conversation, that recognizes that, they may need support further down the line. But I think thankfully, we're seeing these shifts, and also employees are getting wind of this. They're starting to recognize what other organizations are doing, and they're also just leaving. They leave organizations if this isn't done right. I've heard of plenty of people, even within the last few months, who have, put their employer on blast on LinkedIn, or put it on social media, or just made a super swift exit of their organization. So yeah, I'm reluctant to say they're trends, because I think it's kind of the new standard. I don't think they're going to go anywhere.
Sure. No, that's first of all, thank you. You smashed those 5. Those are amazing. I have a couple follow-up questions on that. But the fact that you are talking about it being the new standard versus a trend, brings a lot of attention to the conversation that is so needed. I mean, the fact that from the folks that I've talked to that have not experienced close loss, that are in charge of policy, they have just said, hey, we don't know where to go, we don't know where to turn. And the policy, when a teammate suffers a loss, is very reflective of the fact that the business doesn't know what to do and hasn't planned on it. And that, to your point, can drive all sorts of attraction, retention struggles. It can employer brand struggles if it's out on social media. It's a very public thing. I'm curious. One of the questions that we get a lot is about the differentiation between family members, and talking about the modern family structure. And we use the example a lot where I had an uncle who I saw at Christmas every year, and did for my entire life. And that's about when I saw him. He passed away. I also have a friend from grade school whose uncle raised him. right? So we each have this uncle, right? And that means it's a very different family dynamic between my uncle and I and his uncle and him. How do you actually define companies? I think struggle, from what I hear, trying to do they list the top 10 people that they're closest to, or like how do they figure out the closeness of bond? Like how do they work through that with their teammates when a loss is suffered?
Let me see if I can give you an example. This one that I mentioned just before, I actually have it in front of me. So let's see what if I can find what they say. Yeah, so I think it's essentially, I think you can outline exactly what you're trying to imply by this, which is, so we usually agree that more days of compassionate leave when your relationship is really close with the person who died or is ill, and less when you're not as close. So as a guide, this is generally how many days we'll give you. Some situations may need more or less. You and your manager will decide, so talk to them about your circumstances. That's literally verbatim from their policy. So again, I think it's about that trust. We trust you to tell us, in your case, for example, an uncle who you maybe weren't that close with. And I've had similar situations myself. When my dad died, I hadn't spoken to him for 10 years, but I grew up in a very kind of untraditional, unconventional family where I grew up in New Zealand, and my neighbors helped us out a lot. They would drive me to school. They would come to my hockey games. They would, we hung out as essentially an extended family. So if God forbid one of them were to die, I didn't need a ton of time when my dad passed away. But if I found out that one of them had died, I would want to go back to New Zealand and make sure I was there to see them and their family and comfort them. So I think you just have to trust that if you have those good relationships, and this is what I say about, really restrictive policies, often a band-aid for poor culture and, poor management, dare I say, because if you don't have a good relationship with your report, they're not going to feel comfortable telling you that. And also you don't feel comfortable to ask them, what is your family situation? What is your, what happens in your culture when someone dies? Or is it common that you're raised by people other than your parents? Because for me, that wasn't the case either. Like, are you able to have those conversations? If not, then of course you're going to want this watertight policy that says, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that X person in your family died, but if you look at the policy, this is how many days you get. I get that temptation, but I think, if what we're really talking about is supporting people, we have to trust that people will tell us who matters to them and also who doesn't, not making those assumptions, right?
Right. So in that case, there's a trusting culture that developed a policy that was open and aware of different family structures, and also on top of that added flexibility to say, hey, in this situation it might be this many days, but it might be less, it might be more, and that's kind of your call.
Yeah, and also I think that invitation, that it's a conversation, I think sometimes policies can seem very concrete because it's kind of, this is what we're telling you that you have the privilege of doing because you work for us, which I think is also a very kind of outdated concept. I think it's very strange that as an employer, if I was hiring people, I can't imagine ever trying to tell my employee how much time they get when someone they care about has died. That just seems strange in and of itself. So I think encouraging that this is the conversation, talk to your manager, you will decide together what this looks like, and trusting the manager in that situation, and also trusting the people around that manager. So their manager and your HR team and your peer support groups and the rest of the colleagues that are in that team, trusting that you're going to come to the right decision together. Because again, if you've hired the right people, if you actually live your values, if you're walking the talk of this, I guess, we always talk about compassionate cultures. If you actually want to live that, then you have to be open to people taking you up on it and maybe challenging you on it as well. This isn't the most compassionate way, or actually you're telling me I can have 5 days, but I need more than that. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's work out, is that paid leave? Is it unpaid? Can I come back, flexi time? Can I work mornings, but maybe I spend the afternoon with my family so I can pick up my kids? Whatever it is, like, make it open to a conversation.
Wow. Yeah. Really appreciate that. One of the things that that you said was keep it short. And I feel like some of the policies that I have seen that are the exact opposite of what you're talking about are relatively short, and they're just quick hit. here's this many days for this type of loss, here's this many days for this type of loss, and that's it, right? So is there do you see a balance? Because it feels to me like there's often much more information that's desired by an employee. So like what's the balance of and I can probably make some assumptions, but the 9-page bereavement policy versus the 2-page and too short, right? What do you see the things that should be included if someone were just to get a start right now and look at their bereavement policy, and if they are embarrassed by it for whatever reason, what is a little bit of a framework or some of the things that they should be thinking about on just how to get some things on paper and then how to go make the case internally to go do that?
Yeah, so I think where I've seen this be really effective and what we've worked with some of our members to do is, like, I love a hyperlink, right? So like not everything has to be in that specific policy. So I would sit down as a policy team, have a chat to some employees who have actually gone through this or gone through your process of taking your bereavement leave, talk to your comms team. I don't think we use comms enough in policies. You know, they're great at writing and they know your tone of voice, they know your employee brand. Use them to make it sound good. If you work in HR, you're not necessarily, I mean, maybe some people are, but I mean, I worked in HR for a long time. I never got taught about writing. I got taught how to write a policy, but I never got taught how to write in a compassionate way that sounded nice. So I think include more people in that process, but I would keep it super simple. What are the main things that someone, and most of the time it's the manager, right? I think we need to keep that in mind. It's not the bereaved person themselves. Most of the time it's the manager that's going to be reading this policy. So I would think about, imagine a manager sitting down with this policy. What tone do you want to set in terms of how they should go and approach this and have this conversation? Because I also think that's a kind of missed opportunity. If you're supporting that manager and feeling well equipped to do it and trust in the organization, they're going to feel more confident to have the conversation too. So kind of strip it back, go, what's the most essential information that someone's going to need? Usually it's how much time am I going to get? Are there any restrictions on that time? What does it look like when I come back to work? And where else can I get support? Those are like the top things that really you need. So you'll get 10 days paid leave. If you need more than this, have a chat to your manager. There's ways that we can get around that. There's no restrictions on family members. There's no restrictions on when you need to take this leave. If you want to put restrictions in there, by all means, but we wouldn't recommend it. When you come back to work, your manager will get in touch with you a few days before then to have a conversation. You can ask for a phased return. You can ask for workplace adjustments. We'll work with you to make sure that you feel well supported to be back at work. And here's a list of organizations relevant to our organization, where we're located, peer support groups, bereavement helplines, information about specific, funeral practices, or here's what to do if someone dies in your state, really practical information. Everything else, I would honestly just put as a hyperlink at the bottom of the page. So if you have a guide for managers, put that as a hyperlink. If you have a guide for what to do in, different circumstances, or essentially here's the fine print for things, but I would keep the most basic important things in that policy, and everything else you can have another link to.
Yeah, it's interesting. You even talked about in policy, you talked about reentry, and you talked about support system resources that might be available. Do you see that? Do you see the reentry being addressed, or is that something typically that you and your team have to go in and say, hey, what are you doing to consider when someone comes back to work? Are companies often thinking through that far, or do you have to highlight that for them?
I think honestly, it's probably the biggest missed opportunity that people have. So they look at their policy and they say, well, we're doing a really great job because we offer 5 days paid leave, 10 days paid leave. The UK average is around 3 to 5, which isn't enough. But let's say they offer 5 days and they kind of tick that box and say, okay, we've got a policy, we've written it, it's been revised within the last 5 years. That's great. We've kind of sorted that out. Then there's no consideration of when that person returns. I think it's grounded in this myth that if someone's back at work, then they're fine, which we know isn't true. They may be back at work. It doesn't mean that they're performing to to what they were before they went off on bereavement leave. Doesn't mean that they're not going to be affected by being at work. So, I mean, I wouldn't go into a huge amount of detail about your return to work process. That's probably one of those like supplementary guides that you could create. But I would encourage people to start with their bereavement policy because that's probably going to have the most impact immediately, and then start to think about what's that return to work process, particularly for managers, because I think often people will come back, they maybe get some support on the first day, maybe even the first week, but that kind of 2-3 week, 3 months period, nothing. It's just absolute silence. And this person, meanwhile, is going through probably the worst thing they're ever going to experience in their life, bar their own death. It's like the most significant thing that's ever going to happen. And you've literally just acted as if they've been on vacation for 2 weeks. So it's bizarre to me that we just bring people back, plop them back into their office, same desk, same work. Here's everything you missed. Here's all the reports that I need to have by Friday, and expect them to be fine, because it's not only is it unfair, but it's just unrealistic that you would expect someone to do that.
Totally. No, I'm glad, and I'm so glad you pointed out the converse of flexibility and talk about some of the rigidity that shows up when somebody gets back into that seat, because that can be some of the toughest stories we hear are about the day that they return to work and the attention that is or is not given to that person in that moment. I'm curious, folks that are, let's call it an HR director who is passionate about this, they understand the impact on the human side, but might be getting pushback from maybe the C-suite, and C-suite are having a hard time conveying the business case. Have you bumped into a business case, a business reason where a CFO or a CEO might really want to sit down and spend time on this?
I think, unfortunately, it's probably the biggest hurdle we have, is that there'll be someone, and maybe they're a HR manager or a director of HR, and they're really passionate about it, usually because they've had their own experience or because they've seen their team kind of struggle to support someone through a bereavement. And then we make all our recommendations, which are based on national benchmarking, our own research, other people's research. And then the organization essentially says, either we can't afford this, we can't give people paid time off because it's just not viable financially, or it's not a priority for us right now. We think there are more important things to be, more important policies to be writing, or things that we should be spending our money on. I guess my rebuttal to that, based on anecdotal but also research that we've done, is people take the time anyway. So I guess the challenge that I would put to those senior leaders or people in organizations, if you're trying to build that business case, is look at things like your sick leave after someone takes bereavement, look at things like productivity in those teams, retention, churn rate of people that have had a bereavement in the last 1, 2, even 5 years, because we know it can affect people for a very long time afterwards. We see, I'm just thinking of stats that we did even just this year for our Dying Matters campaign. 39% of people had lied about taking leave that was actually bereavement leave, but they said it was something else. Half of people use their annual leave. So people are away from the workplace anyway, whether they take that as annual leave, which then means they're more likely to burn out because they're not actually taking time as vacation time and time with their family or time off. So people are taking the time anyway. So I guess the business case for me is people are already doing it, and they're lying to us about it, and they're feeling guilty about it. And we're creating a culture where people are hiding the reality of what's happening in their lives. They're coming back before they're ready, so they're not productive. 58% of people told us that they were still being affected in terms of productivity months after their bereavement. So I would look at things like that in your organization specifically. But if you don't have that data, I'm happy to provide that to people so you can give that to them. Because I guess the question is, do you want, if it's already happening, you're already paying for it, people are already taking time away, they're already not being productive. So what's the harm in offering that transparently, paying people for it, giving them the support? It's already happening. So why not do it in a way that's, it's not just a bit oftentimes we talk about this in this kind of fluffy way, it's a nice thing to do, it's the right thing to do. 100% agree with that. It's also just makes business sense. If I was running a business or a company tomorrow, I would give everyone 10 days paid bereavement leave, because I know it's just the most effective way to get them back into work, to retain them, to make sure they stay loyal to me, to make sure that they don't have resentment against their manager and their team, which completely erodes relationships. It just makes sense in terms of a business. So there is that data out there. And I'm sure that's the same for a lot of organizations where they could pull that data and show that business case.
Yeah, incredible. So incredibly valuable, and I'm seeing it in the chats. And if you're not, Faith, your time here is incredibly valuable to the folks that are here today, and we'll obviously broadly share that with other people to make sure that your that your expertise and your fingerprints are on change that is made is, throughout the United States or throughout Bereave's marketing, whatever it is, incredibly valuable, and so grateful for that. Georgina, I want to flip to you for a second. You responded to a survey we ran a few months ago, and were one of the few responses that really stood out in just such a positive way. A few quotes that we noticed that I'm going to read. I probably should have gotten permission. I think I did, maybe, hopefully. You said something like, "My team were really extremely understanding of me not coming back to work. And even when I came back to work, they gave me a lot of flexibility." One of the things that Faith just highlighted was flexibility. Also, unwavering and doing what I needed, no questions asked. So to have this was incredible for me. I look back now and realize how amazing that was. So in order to write things like that and to think back about that time and to reflect in the way you did, can you talk a little bit about the experience that they provided that made you say things like that are pretty powerful?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I thought I had that amazing experience. They hit 2 of the 5 things Faith talked to. So think how there's still room for improvement. So my mum passed, and it was very sudden and unexpected. And I mentioned to you, Justin, to this day, I still don't know what the policy was in my contract. And kudos to that team, because maybe they did or didn't. I don't know what happened behind the scenes. So for all the talk of policy, I don't know how it was written. I assume I had 5 days. I actually took 3.5. So I'm in a bit of an extreme case in that I'm based in the US. My mum was in the UK, so I went back for 3.5 weeks because of the funeral times. But I kind of, what I pulled out of what Faith just said is that flexibility. And you did make me chuckle at the fluffiness, because I had some fluffiness in here. But no one bothered me. I think that was, and
Sure.
what really resonated, Faith, with what you just said is the manager's role. Because I can only imagine what happened behind the scenes to say, make sure like we give Georgina the space to do what I needed to do. And while I think I came back fighting fit, I probably wasn't, like Faith said. But I know I wasn't. But the feelings that I had, it's more than feeling, like the loyalty I had to that team, still to this day, for the silence that they gave me. Now, I was a good employee. I checked in regularly. I think I gave good communication on what was and wasn't happening. But the fact that I could take that 3 weeks, be with my family, without that worry or extra concern, at a time that was already ridiculously overwhelming, is how I would just politely sum it up.
Sure.
For me, I feel very grateful for that. Justin, we mentioned yesterday, I feel fortunate. I was very senior. So I think everything that Faith said about making that making my experience accessible to anyone in the organization, because maybe I got lucky, right? At that time.
Yeah, totally. It's pretty clear. I was going to ask you what the response ultimately meant to you at that time, but it feels like we can probably make those assumptions. But I'm curious. You said something. You mentioned it here and also in the survey that you look back and realize how amazing it was to have that reaction. Did you have that reaction at the time? Did you know how amazing it was in that moment? Or were you able to, was that a reflection piece that occurred much later?
Much later.
Yeah.
This was the first time anything like this had happened to me. So you just, again, Faith, what you just said about clarity and simplicity, I never got given a document, but there's no way I would have been able to comprehend that. And I probably would have put 2 fingers up at it anyway, because I would have just been like, it's such a life-changing moment, right? And you know, I got treated very well. I can imagine, Faith, that scenario you talked about. If that hadn't have gone well, I would have, because your belief system changes when something.
Yeah, and it sounds like the belief system and what you had signed up for, working for that company with that team, with those people, that changes very quickly. And so there's a big loss, especially to a senior leader, in doing the opposite of what they did for you. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
But yeah, 100%. And again, the word
Yeah.
trust massively resonated. The trust that, now my manager at the time was the global CEO. So it's very different, but I've tried to now implement that with my teams. How do you just give people the space of what they need? Because you're right, it's the manager that makes or breaks.
Yeah, that's
situations.
amazing. Well, thank you so much, Georgina, for sharing that. We're about at time, and I think we did it, and I think we didn't screw it up too badly for our first time doing this. So I hope there weren't any technical hiccups or anything like that for anybody. Faith, Georgina, thank you so incredibly much. We are indebted to you. We're incredibly grateful for the work that you put into this, for the time that you've put into this. Incredibly generous of you. On tap for next week, Loss Leaders will be joined by the CEO of Cocoon, Mahima Chawla, who they are a leave management company, to discuss a very public approach to building a culture of compassion. Simply put, Mahima's a baller, and we've got another special guest joining, so you won't want to miss that. Lastly, your raw feedback on what went well and what didn't today. We have thick skin, so come at us unfiltered if you're willing to provide it. Just unfiltered, raw, just throw it at us. We will greatly appreciate it. We're trying to get better here week by week. Again, Faith, Georgina, again, so grateful that you're here today. Really appreciate everything that you've put into this, and we'll talk soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.